the very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is openness to the whole state of things, pure violence without option anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Welcome to this week's edition of Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins. As always, sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Before we introduce today's discussion, consider tossing us $1 a month at www.patreon.com/MUHH. We are including access to our Discord server. We've been doing reading groups for a while now. The majority of those have been recorded and are available to listen, available on Patreon rather. And we're going to continue to do that. And we're trying to keep the Discord server active and so forth. So, just consider that if you're enjoying the content that Taylor and I have been putting out, because there's some great discussions going on. And I think we've had pretty good participation. And I think that is going to continue to snowball, so to speak. But today we're going to be looking at another of Paul Virilio's works. This one is Speed in Politics. Previously, we did discuss War and Cinema. I think there's some subtle connections between those two. I think ultimately maybe the development of technology and its impact on culture directly is kind of, or maybe even media more specifically, because this book does focus a bit on, I think, messaging. There's some quotes from Goebbels and so forth about manipulation and what have you, but it kind of runs the gamut from, I think, the infrastructure. And I think, interestingly, you mentioned to me that Verilio actually studied architecture, which is really cool. And that kind of really tracks.
He built a fucking church.
Oh, that's rad.
Yeah. We'll have to look up images of it. Maybe he built a church with some of that a kind of fallout shelter feel.
Huh.
I'll have to look that up. Go on, though. Sorry.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think I just had a nebulous comment about. I feel like in reading Virilio again, he kind of sort of matches. He's kind of like this hybrid. He definitely. I feel like there's a lot of Deleuzian concepts in the background, even though he might not use the terminology. Even though I think some places he really kind of does. And then he kind of fits the kind of more Baudrillardian style to some degree. Maybe not as provocative and acerbic, but I don't know.
Here, I'm going to share this with you because I agree. I know that there's a couple of references I was looking at. One is called the Virilio Dictionary, and it does have an entry on Baudrillard, and it had some quotes from Virilio kind of saying like how they were simpatico, except they kind of diverge at a certain point. And it has to do, I think, with their different forms of Catholicism, if we can even think of Baudrillard as being Catholic, which, kind of comes with the French territory a little bit. But, the thing would be sort of like on Baudrillard's side, a way of warding off the impending apocalypse or seeing simulations role in that and almost like exploring that. Whereas I think Virilio wants to ward off, and it's almost like vice versa, right? Wants to ward off the simulated so that the real apocalypse can appear. It was very cryptic, and I'd have to like see the context in the interview, but it did seem like they never became enemies in any simple way, and at least started off with similar types of post May 68 type reflections.
Yeah.
I've if you click on this link, it'll pull up. I put it in the chat right here. If you pull it up, it's like look at this shirt. Look at like the outside of this.
Oh yeah, it looks like a fortress.
Yeah. So, and that makes sense if you consider so much of the topic
Right. Oh, this is
of
rad. This is kick ass. But yeah, this is like a fucking. This is like crazy brutalist.
maybe you could use one of these images and repurpose it.
That's a
You
great
know.
idea. Actually, I like that a lot. That's a
In any
great
case,
suggestion.
so the just for the listener, this is called the Church of Saint Bernadette de Bonlay, and it's in Nevers. Never. I don't know where that is in France. Spelled Nevers, but never. Anyway.
Hey, before you get too deep into it, would you do me a favor and in the settings for Zoom, would you like see it's what is that setting for like mm, where it kind of I don't know if I can hear Lindsay or something in the background
Okay. Yeah.
bleeding over just a bit. I think you can like there's that background noise
Okay. I turned up the background
cool
noise
cancellation or whatever. It's something like that.
cancellation. Does that work
Yeah.
better? Is that better?
Yeah, so far it is. I haven't
Okay.
yeah, it
Okay.
seems to be yeah.
And I guess I would suggest it definitely ties into his interest in what he calls bunker archaeology, right?
Yeah.
And his fascination with bunkers because it has that brutalist feel, but it also kind of looks like a bunker or a fallout shelter.
Right.
Um, so yeah, he definitely not only studied architecture but practiced it. And then I don't know enough about his biography to know when how much he is learning, like whether or not he went to another degree or just sort of more autodidactic and whatnot. But this is maybe like one of the reasons why he's an interesting figure. He's not in the traditional academia timeline that we see some of these other French thinkers. Um, he's it's kind of like what we were discussing with Simondon, right? Being in the Polytechnic framework, being sort of pigeonholed as a technologist. Um, Although Verilio was definitely much more prolific, right? Simondon didn't like continuously publish books, whereas Verilio did. And but in any case, yeah, it's Speed and Politics is one of his first books. I don't think it's his very first. I'd have to check on that, but it's one of his first from 1977. And the War and Cinema book comes out in the early mid 80s. Do you remember the date? It was maybe 84, 86. Um, but interestingly enough, the sources I looked at arguing that his most famous books, which is kind of a bit, I don't know what you say, sometimes subjective, but those two books, Speed and Politics and War and Cinema, are perhaps his most cited books. So
86 according to
okay,
Google is for War and Cinema.
gotcha.
So I think
Yeah.
go ahead.
No, I was just thinking. The last thing I was thinking last night was how Speed and Politics definitely almost sounds like a history of drug use in like World War II or something.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure, and I could be wrong, but I don't think the word speed, vitesse in French has anything to do with amphetamines. I'll check that right now, but you can imagine it's like that's just a happy coincidence, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of interesting given the use of the Nazis using speed and the Blitzkrieg.
The Japanese too, like refined it, made it methamphetamine, right? So the Germans and the Japanese, you could see a Virillion. I guess that's what you might call it, a Virillion type of argument that the development of amphetamines and methamphetamines by the fascists is not necessarily some sort of coincidence, that it
Yeah.
is about a conquering of time and an implementation of the human body so that it can harness time in a way to better dominate it. But go ahead.
Oh, I mean, that's interesting in the sense of like the intensity of the dopamine or whatever. I'm not sure what the neurochemistry
Mm-hmm.
involved is, but I recall I took this class, Drugs and Society, and it was talking about how the spike that you get from cocaine use is like, I don't know, I forget what the unit measurements were, but it's something like the spike of whatever it was, like 200 versus the spike in meth is like 1,000.
Okay, interesting. Yeah.
So there's a certain, that's like the sort of intensity, the intensiveness of the drug itself
It,
also plays a role.
it is interesting too that we could see a convergence in towards the end of the book when he, even though he had been hinting at it, but he kind of focuses on this proletarianization of the military forces. And there's a sense in which, the various, I mean, obviously this notion of speed in politics, and I was being a little bit glib, but you can see how, for example, the use of coffee, various stimulants would easily fit into the framework of what he's talking about, because he does kind of base his whole um, the whole dromological, to use his term, right? The study of speed. It's all based at the very beginning, if you will, or at least in part, on primitive accumulation, right? So it's
Oh, interesting.
so even the role of unpaid labor of women is one of the bases for which men get a little bit more free time to then go out and, however you want to, if you want to take an anthropological view, they can go and hunter gather or whatnot, even if that's probably a simplistic view. But you can see that in looking out. You don't even have to get historical or ancient about it. You can see how that still, even today, plays a kind of role of the division of labor between the sexes and the classes is part of this dromological, this perspective of looking at how speed is a factor that isn't just about projectiles and moving bodies, right? There is a sense in which a conquering of time and opening up of dimensions of time is part and parcel of this. I didn't think I appreciated that until sort of uh, looking at some overviews of some of his other works and
Mhm.
thinking about it. I don't think that I appreciated. I think I was taking speed too literally, which is why I was telling you that he quotes Napoleon, uh, looking at different armies and some mechanics of mass times speed, uh, to measure their force, and and that was a little bit simplistic what I was telling you, because it involves factors of acceleration rather than speed. But all of this is. I think that if we broaden our conception of speed to opening up dimensions of time or harnessing time, and obviously that plugs into uh, conceptions of capital and capitalism, no doubt, right? And labor power. So, um,
Modernity, modernity, even more, to get broader than that too, because to I think the architectural aspect, the background on Virilio's architectural or relationship to architecture is really fascinating. That's like one of the two pronged areas that I find super fascinating. Like one of the most interesting things to me was he discusses, I think, the move from like the medieval castle or fortress, the defensive position
yeah.
in something like feudalism in medieval Europe or what have you, or wherever, I suppose, versus the more, I don't know, it's like the move towards offense as a form
Hmm.
of defense via the speeding up of time and those cycles. And just, I think maybe even the concept, right? Because like there's a, there's a waiting aspect to defense versus offense, which, before before clocks were standardized, there was a different rhythm perhaps that life would take. And so that sort of interestingly tracks with the means by which warfare was conducted, you know.
Yes. Yeah, and so you can see in this early book, I think the some of the phenomenological aspects of the discussions of time, but it's also interesting to me, and I told you this, where, and this is why you brought up the convergence of Deleuze and Baudrillard. I think maybe even more than either of them, he relies so heavily on historical encounters. And so like he almost feels, if you had to guess, you wouldn't necessarily think he's an architect. You would think he might be a historian,
Yeah.
just by the references that he makes and he's working with. And I think that part of his work is, it's on the one hand, it's a lot to keep up with, but on the other hand, it really does ground him in a certain
Yeah.
point of view.
Right.
And it's so that's why I think Speed and Politics, at some point I'm going to have to revisit it, because I do feel like there's a lot of, I was trying to get the big picture for our discussion, but there's a lot of key details that could obviously be focused in on. So,
I kind of, just as a result of my Game of Thrones or A Song of Ice and Fire fandom, became interested in castle defenses, which I like. This is one of my
yeah.
little niche interests that I think is super fascinating, because you don't really think about, the way that, for example, I forget what they call the arrow slits in the.
Embouchures, isn't that what they're technically called?
I'm not sure,
I think they're called an embouchure. Embrasure. You can shoot projectiles out of them.
but it's like the. I mean, but I think also this, because the other aspect is infrastructure is a big part of, because he focuses on these early on in the book, the discussion of the streets and so forth, which I take as a focus on infrastructure and flows and energy and so forth. So the way that those arrow slits are spaced out in a castle is designed to give you like overlapping fields of defense. So you can shoot arrows. So they would even, so on the outside, there's a very narrow opening that would widen so that the archer or whomever with their crossbow or regular bow or what have you, they've got the ability to maneuver at a certain freedom of, certain few degrees from the inside, while also mitigating the potential for incoming projectiles to take them out. But they would space them out along the castle wall, so to speak, in varying ways that there would be overlap. So there's never like, and it's all no man's land, so to speak. You know what I mean? Where you would space out your archers or crossbowmen or what have you, so that there's like full on kill zone for any approaches to the castle, which, is just not something that you necessarily jump to immediately when you think of castle defense.
No, it's a good point. Um, and it is interesting that one of the words that he uses that we actually get from the French, and so it's not, you could say it's not translated, but it's the same word in French, is the glacis, right? The slope in front of the castle fortification. And he spends a lot of time in the early part of the book talking about the development of this slope, because you were describing how, in this transition from this medieval type fortification where the castle is more or less part and parcel of the of a village, if you will, of a population. And then as it develops, and as the technological means develop, obviously with things like gunpowder, these fortifications become much less, or they become much more specialized and much less tied to everyday life of civilian life, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's even some cool like etymological things like the central tower. I think the French word is like or phrase is like donjon, donjon,
Yeah, yeah.
which obviously you can see how that turns into dungeon, for
Yeah.
example. But I think as well, just to get back into really the meat of the discussion about speed but it's like not just speed, it's also about territory. And as part of that, it's about the management of space.
The
And
management of space and how that interacts or becomes almost less important as he argues or wants to argue than the management or the territorialization of time, right? Was that where you're going? Or
well, I wanted to get just to I think the relate because so just my example of the arrow slits in the castle wall, right? Like that's a prime example of how one would manage how space would be managed, for example. And I think what's the interesting parallel is something like in the sports world, like in modern sports, whether it be basketball, soccer, football, even baseball, obviously, maybe even that's I think typically baseball maybe is the most spatially focused or has been had that focus, whereas something like American football has developed that in a different way because something like I don't know if you're familiar with like the spread offense and what that really entails. It's about it's about space and it's about speed because what you
yeah,
do is it's all about the way that bodies in space and time combine to present these opportunities. So it's like when you spread the defensive players out on a wider gradient, maybe we should say, that opens up. So like if you're doing a no huddle, that also plays a part, right? Because it's like we're moving as fast as we can. We're getting up to the line. We're putting a lot of pressure on the defense, and the defense is always at a disadvantage because they're reacting, right? And I mean that maybe that's another interesting
Hmm.
thing to discuss, moving from the fortress or the castle as a reactive position to an offensive mode of conflict or warfare or what have you. But to draw the example out further as far as football is concerned, yeah. So it's like whenever you create, you widen out the spacing of the defensive players, that allows for seams within the defense, so that spaces open up, combined with the speed and combined with the ability to have multiple options of deployment. Let's say between the run pass option, for example, that opens up those lanes, right? So much of sports, interestingly enough, is actually about this relationship between speed and space as far as attack goes, right? And so in a way that the offense really now with the spread offense in football attacks the defense in a different way, right? And puts them on sort of their back heels through this speed and spacing aspect and the relationship between that speed, spacing, and time.
that's good. It reminds me of one of the little entries in this Verilio dictionary of he coined the term claustropolis, uh, which just kind of conjoins some of the factors you brought in, right? This uh, acceleration of temporal dimensions that that brings about a kind of collapsing of spatial dimensions that leads to a kind of inherent anxiety, claustrophobia in the city living.
Yeah. To draw the sports example out further too, like I mean, you love baseball. This would be something like the shift, or like what I mean? Because really, baseball ultimately it's about what's the famous? Is it Pee Wee Reese that had the hit 'em where they ain't, or was that Yogi
Yeah,
Berra?
that's it's one of those. Yeah,
So yeah, it's about like positioning in space and taking advantage of the gaps.
that's the fleet in being, right? Is the
Interesting.
different?
Nice.
That's the that's another Virilio term that you've got marked here, the fleet and being, to a certain extent. Yeah, the different shifts, and now they've even had to cut back on what's possible, right? If you remember, if over the years, the shift, different types of shift where like left-handed batters became so popular that you would be bringing in um, more, you'd be bringing in defense from the outfield, or double overlapping to block their access, and they've had to basically rule it out that no matter what, there can only be four infielders besides the pitcher and the catcher. So you can move wherever you want, but you can't bring in extra help.
Interesting.
So, but yeah, I mean, that is a type of fleet in being. You can use that sports analogy for all the sports. I'm sure you can think
Yeah.
about the different formations in European football and soccer. You can think about it in basketball, the way that there's the zone defense, right, rather than man on man defense.
Yeah.
So
I mean, basketball in particular, also, it's really interesting that they all kind of share this trajectory too, because like in the 90s and even maybe early 2000s, you would find a lot more, kind of the focus on like NBA basketball in particular, because you don't, it's like zone, you couldn't really run zone for a long time. I think
yeah,
they've
yeah,
softened up some of that rule a bit, but the kind of primary offensive production was like the mid-range jumper
yep,
and like like down, getting it to the post and like driving to the lane. But now I think, the Warriors and Steph Curry in particular like revolutionized the game to where it's like like if you look at the development of shot distribution, it's crazy. It's like everything's either packed in the paint or it's like outside of the 3-point line.
yep.
If you look at
The
like
perimeter,
a heat map or what have you, and it's totally changed. And also, just because the spacing opportunities that creates, same thing with, I was talking about the spread offense. It's like you're really, if when you widen out the defense in that way, it really presses them to be able to you know to be able to defend, because it's like there's such a big gap between your perimeter shooters and the kind of guys down low. So I don't know. I just thought that's super interesting.
yeah. And I think I told you this last time. I guess we weren't recording, but the fleet in being and smooth space are terms that we will see in 1,000 Plateaus, right? And that sort of right before the conclusion, we'll have that plateau on smooth space and striated space, and that's going to be where some of our discussions of Virilio and familiar with his work is going to pay off again, because they definitely rely on Virilio for some of these terms. And so the fleet in being, I do think it's just I mean, it's meant to be a, a at least primarily maritime concept, right? And that's something that he alludes to, where one of the ways in which, with the development of capitalism, that sort of England is able to take on a dominance in its own way is by occupying the seas. And that's, I think if I remember correctly, he gives the example of how was it Venice, or at least it was in that area that he's, as the British become more dominant on the seas, those in Venice and in the Italian peninsula have to focus more on land, and that entails a total shift of their way of being. So, yeah, the fleet in being able to sort of strike without warning, and as though omnipresently holding this territory that is not land, right? It's kind of it's an interesting concept, and we'll be able to flesh it out more when that time comes.
I mean, you could even look at the sea as a type of infrastructure in the way that he uses the Goebbels example of the streets being so much of a, like, I forget what the quote was from Goebbels about the streets. I think I have it saved though. See if I can
Basically,
find-
like occupying streaks is how you occupy the state, but that's more or less what I remember. But maybe that's not the quote you're thinking of.
the
Let me
ideal militant is the political combatant. Da, da, da. No, that's not it.
find.
It was something about like the gist of it was that like whoever controls the streets kind of controls the.
So this looks like page 30. It says, let's see. For the various revolutionary groups, as for the Apaches and other shady populations of the city's outskirts, it will be less a matter when the time comes of occupying a given building than upholding the streets. In 1931, during the National Socialist struggle against the Marxist parties in Berlin, Goebbels notes, whoever can conquer the streets also conquers the state. I was close. I was close to, I think that's what you were thinking of.
Yes, that was precisely what I was thinking of.
Okay.
So yeah, it's like whoever kind of similar, like whoever controls the seas controls
Yep. Exactly.
the world. Now the logical leap I make from that is the infrastructure of communication, like in our modern world, right? Something like the social media, etc. Right, that accelerates the process of communication and like it changes the game as far as things are concerned with respect to like Steve Bannon, for example, is like talks about flooding the zone, so flooding media with so much bullshit and like disinformation and whatever, and the speed of that and being able to get that out quickly and just relentlessly push and push with bullshit and lies and misinformation and so forth really allows that's kind of what allows a certain dominance, right?
Yeah. You said
Propagate itself.
saturate. You said
Yes.
flood the zone, saturate the zone. Is that what you said?
Flood the zone, I think, is
Flood
what
the
he
zone.
says. Which
Same concept. Yeah. The oversaturation of uh, misinformation, disinformation. It makes sense why Musk would want to buy Twitter, right?
precisely.
Not just to try to like get more validation from his bots and his right wing cheerleaders, but it's obvious that he himself, in his own account, often is on at the forefront of this type of misinformation. So
Exactly, and it really kind of parallels, right? It's like legacy. He even directly attacks mainstream or legacy media,
sure.
and you can really see the, you can, yeah, I think to me draw the parallel between legacy media and the fortress to some extent, at least a type of metaphorical relationship, because it's like the defensive position. Not only that, but the ability of whenever you're flooding the zone, so to speak, with bullshit, it takes you're so busy reacting to their message, and even just the time as well, it becomes a factor with respect to like
Yeah.
actually analyzing what's being said, and even just the structure of traditional media with certain like there's editors and so forth. There's a whole process versus the unfiltered direct impact of instantaneous light speed communication that can circle the globe in a minute, and viral communication that really sets the discourse, sets the narrative before the mainstream media or legacy media can even react at any point. So it's like it almost creates this like what's the word I'm looking for? Not stasis, but like inability to move. You know what I mean? You're kind of crippled by.
It's a black hole.
Yeah.
It's a semiotic black hole, right? I mean, we know that information can't escape if light can't from it. So, and that involves itself this question of speed and collapse. This is one of the interesting things about another term, because you do have a bunch of the terms he has there. We may not go through all of them, but one of the terms that you may or may not have noted, and I'm just looking, is the accident. And he doesn't spend as much time on it here in this book. It becomes more and more elaborated Specifically, he's got a whole book dedicated to it called The Original Accident, came out in 2005. But the accident is really cool because I think it's very intuitive to understand where the conditions of possibility of a technology, right, which we've been studying with Simondon, right, where he kind of talks about how the technical apparatus, the associated milieu with which it's paired is it's its own transcendental conditions of possibility. It makes itself possible through sort of determining a problematic field. There's something where Virilio takes with this that whatever makes a technical, whether it be an object, however, whatever scale we want to look at, whatever makes a technical progression, advancement forward for it to solve a problem, also opens up the conditions of possibility of the accident that is associated with it. So he takes an Aristotelian definition, like the accident, which is a kind of, if you will, a symptom, or it points back to a thing's essence, even if it doesn't inherently define it. And he turns it on its head, where a thing's essence necessarily implies a kind of accident that it makes possible at the same time. So obviously, like, the paradigmatic is the railway made the train crash possible, right? We can extend this obviously to cars, but I do think that he too spends time thinking at the end of his life with a book called The Information Bomb, where he's thinking too about the kind of speed of light transactions we've discussed, not just in social media, but like the ability to make, even automate trades in the stock market at the speed of light. Those kind of the those kind of technological advancements make possible these singularly destructive uh, accidents that, again, it may not be the same kind of explosiveness as like nuclear power implying a bomb or the collapse of a nuclear power plant. But one of the things that Verilio tries to theorize, and I think you can kind of almost see him working through this without using this language, is he almost theorizes what he calls a museum of the accident, where it might even be like an anti-museum to a certain extent, but it's basically, his argument is it's not to become Ludditish, even though that might seem at first glance the answer, right? To do a kind of Butlerian jihad and destroy the thinking machines. It seems to be more about becoming aware of the very possibility that with each new technological advancement, there is in sort of an embryonic form, there is the possibility of the type of accident that it portends.
Yeah, something like drone technology, for
Mm-hmm.
example, would be an extension of that, I think. But it's funny because you kind of even preemptively anticipated what my thought was, because I even tweeted about this the other day. It was like, there are two wolves inside me. One is a technological, what was it, determinist,
Yes,
uh,
something like that.
or pessimist, and the other one is a slightly less pessimistic
Mm.
technological determinist. And
Now,
I think actually, what I at some point I think we should really look at McLuhan as well, because I think
yeah,
that
yeah,
would be interesting, especially in dialogue with Virilio. And obviously, Baudrillard draws a lot on, or there's a lot of overlap with,
that's true. He does draw a lot on McLuhan. I'd forgotten that. Yeah.
because it's like the infrastructure of the internet, for example, right? Like it does. I would even go to get to the, because to Goebbels' example with the streets, it goes to the discussion I brought up about, Elon Musk or whomever controlling the flows of information via the infrastructure of the internet and social media. Um, but God, I kind of lost my train of thought there.
No, I mean, it's obviously, you can see this in more traditional, you said legacy media, but like obviously Rupert Murdoch was the old classical, and
Yeah,
he's not the only one of buying newspapers, billionaires
right.
buying newspapers. Uh, Obviously, Bezos has his
The Washington
newspapers.
Post, right? Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so it's not anything new. except in the form in its more instantaneous form, right? And
Yeah.
it's so it has a dromological aspect to that extent, to use Virilio's term. um, and I do like that he makes a bunch of these neologisms with Dromo, right? We have it in the word hippodrome, so it's not just, doesn't mean literally speed, but it has to do with race and the race track, right? The dromos is the uh, and so I think too there's an interesting thing where the speed is a vector. I think we
Right.
have to
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
about it. It has an orientation. It has provisionally a goal towards which it is speeding ahead, um, and so I do think that that is part of why this conquering of space, or this freeing up of space, or sorry, this conquering of time and this freeing up of time, why he does it. I mean, you even see this in, I think it's, gosh, it's, he says this in passing, what I brought up earlier, where it all begins with the basis of primitive accumulation. I think it's in the end of the proletariat. Is that what it's called? Chapter 3 of part 3. Let me see if I can find
That's
it. Where he,
definitely one of the sections. I just don't recall it
it's
specifically enough.
but he starts it with, he lays out 4 or 5, the end of the proletariat. This is page 115. He says, evidently dromological progress and what we conventionally call human and social progress coincided but did not converge. The development can be summarized as follows. One, a society without technological vehicles, in which the woman plays the role of the logistical spouse, mother of war, and of the truck. It's kind of interesting. Two, the indiscriminate boarding of soulless bodies as metabolic vehicles. Um, we can think about his arguments about how the Spanish conquistadors were able to succeed in South America, like vanquishing the Mayans, because they had beasts of burden like horses that gave them the dromological edge over the Mayans. Three, the empire of speed and technological vehicles. Four, the metabolic vehicle competing with and defeated by the earthly technological vehicle. And then he says we could logically conclude with a fifth, the end of five, the end of the dictatorship of the proletariat and of history and the war of time. So that's again, I think that's where sometimes, if we just stop there, we could easily hear a Baudrillardian type of pessimism. I don't think he wants to stop there. I think he wants to again try to bring to light these challenges and potential fates that we face, while also trying to build an awareness that promotes circumventing them. Uh,
This is such a area of tension in my own thought, because it in a lot of ways, especially even with the example of Murdoch or whomever with more legacy media, it feels like just the accumulation of dead labor aspect, which is the compression of time and so forth, and really kind of almost transcending time and labor to a degree, versus as far as capital is concerned versus the worker, or the, you know what I mean? Um, it's almost like as that dead labor accumulates, these avenues for the mediation of technology to be seized by the resistance, so to speak, we'll just
mhm.
call it broadly, become like that narrows perhaps, but I don't know. On the other side of that, I want to say that it was even maybe in Warren Cinema specifically, where, but I'm not 100% sure. But I was thinking about the example of where it was in the cities, the city folk were the ones that adopted um, firearms first,
Mm,
as opposed to the old aristocracy. And
interesting.
and so, you can kind of, they were more likely to seize that, this, and which goes to speed, obviously, in the more direct sense of the projectile, and really negates the sort of the fortress, the defensive position, the castle of the old aristocracy as the dominating force, right? So there is like a line of flight there, so to speak, that becomes available that is seized by the bourgeois to overthrow the aristocracy, right? So if that's the case in history, then obviously it's not maybe this deterministic pessimistic position is it's not hopeless, so to speak, but so that's I don't know, that's just such a big tension in my own thinking and just trying to I have a hard time wrestling with that. I tend to fall into this kind of pessimistic view of any kind of new technology just sets up a new condition for domination because the historical accumulation of capital just goes that way, right?
Yeah.
So the example of the conquistadors, I think it just is another area where that kind of holds true. It's like
Yeah.
whenever you're they're just overwhelmed. Like it kind of feels like we're the natives getting invaded by this alien force that has martial time and speed in a way that we just can't even develop. We're just totally overblown by it.
Yeah, and obviously, you know, horses was I brought that up specifically because it goes from, the uh sort of woman as the foundation of the of the oikos, right, of the home, and allowing for that, but then the domestication of animals. So but obviously gunpowder is a part of that too, right? And that type of vector is itself, we only brought that up in passing when we were talking about castles, but I think that's why he focuses so much on the glossy, that sloped fortification in front of a castle, because one of the developments that with gunpowder and cannon fire is the glossy is almost um, becomes hyper focused and stylized in order to protect from cannon fire in particular, which is interesting too if you think about the fact that um, the way to counteract that would be to actually quote unquote regress to an older technology like a catapult or a trebuchet to get the kind of angle you might need. But that's a whole, obviously that takes us down a kind of like war history thing, which is part and parcel of what he's doing. It's just um it is interesting to think about that slope fortification and why he focuses on it so much.
Yeah, I mean, even that's another. See that even that little nugget is. It's just if you're not accustomed to thinking about fortifications in that way, it's like even something as simple as a slope. And I mean, this is also goes to the concept of the moat as well. It's like
Yeah.
typically, it's like it because going uphill, right, is a lot that requires more energy. It requires more acceleration. It requires more force.
It
Yada
puts you in
yada.
a worse position to be counterattacked, right?
Exactly. It slows down your movement. So it's really about, again, goes to the management of space as such a heavy component of war. And that kind of holds true regardless to some degree, right? Virilio even kind of, I mean, that's kind of like a baseline. There's different methods of dealing with it, but that basic concept, not of that as a defensive position specifically, but of just like broadly the management of space and movement, etc., as a part of warfare or what have you. But you
Let's look at,
also
yeah, go ahead.
you also mentioned, I just wanted to circle back to the accident too, because
Yes.
I mentioned drones and I was thinking about the Michael Crichton book, though I've not read this one, but he's got the book Prey,
Okay.
where it's like
I'm not familiar, but go ahead.
these swarms of nanobots escape and what have you. And so it's like just the speed at which they can attack and so forth. Like it's really kind of the next level, I think, of drone warfare, which drones themselves are getting to the point where it's like, how could you outmaneuver a drone? Like this goes, you know what I mean? Like they can fly into caves, they can, it's like it's like fucking like Terminator shit. You know what I mean? It's like
We
kind of
need a
the ultimate expression of like Skynet, so to speak.
we need a drone to fly to Plato's cave, lead us out.
Right.
But no, you're right. I mean, like, and they're even developing. I know in China they're developing drones that can theoretically be used for transporting of humans, not just of goods. So that kind of ability too is, I mean, obviously theoretically possible. It's just the question of logistics, and that's so much of what this book actually is about. This history of logistics, which is why I think it's interesting. With just to reiterate, where he sees woman freeing up time for the males as a logistical problem that is solved, right? So there's an interesting, baked into the patriarchal cake in prehistory is this logistical problem, this temporal problem that is solved. And it's interesting too, because that goes back to your vector of domination. And this is maybe part of this question of accidents, that it's not merely, it's obviously a much broader category when we think about the accident rather than just a crash or a car crash. But as oops, we have new means for dominating more people and imposing more power relations in various and diverse ways. That itself is, we've seen, that's the dystopian technocratic vector that can be traveled along. And that is always a possibility threatening. I mean, with drones, yes, the speed of warfare, but also the omnipresence of surveillance. Um, do you want to look at one of these other terms? We've got a lot here that we could maybe even just talk about. I do think that Virilio takes deterritorialization um, perhaps more literally than Deleuze and Guattari, though I think it's not, that doesn't mean it's bad. I think it serves its purpose. And again, if you think about it, it's 77. And so deterritorialization, yes, rhizome introduction would have come out in 76, but a thousand plateaus would come out till 80. And the notion of deterritorialization is really situated in a thousand plateaus. So there's an interesting sense in which that term is already, and I know that Deleuze and Guattari said that they got it from geographers, geologists, ecologists. So they do turn it into a concept, and so Deleuze and Guattari, or at least Deleuze, will say we created a concept, but the notion, if you want to use that and distinguish it from at least what Deleuze wants to think of concepts, the notion was already around, and so it is interesting to see that Virilio, before a thousand plateaus, is already using this term, and it may have helped to reinforce that language in Deleuze and Guattari. I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah. I mean, I think that goes to the discussion of holding the streets,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it does.
holding the space of the internet
Right.
in a different manner.
The way it's become more centralized, at least over time, since because we've talked about that. I guess I wonder. I feel like we talked about that with Fiedler, right? With the algorithm of desire, but I'm sure we've talked about it with others. This question of the web and how it has definitely become less decentralized, which was one of its rhizomatic positive properties in its inception, at least theoretically.
Yeah. Yeah. The rise of platforms, kind of universal platform, not quite, universal in scare quotes, perhaps, but yeah, siloing those, versus message boards, or, what I mean? Reddit
Mm-hmm.
becomes a message board, etc.
So yeah, let's look. I'm gonna search through the text and just see how. Uh, let's look at this. Okay, so this is in the boarding of metabolic vehicles. I'm just reading this here. This is bottom of 96, top of 97. Dromological progress by imposing the idea of two types of body dependent on their situation in space also imposes the idea of two types of soul, one weak, indecisive, and vulnerable because it is dependent on its environment, the other powerful because it has put its quote unquote mana, its will, out of reach thanks to its deterritorialization to the sophistication of its economy and viewpoint. And he goes on to work with Clausewitz, who he does cite often.
That's a banger quote.
So it is interesting to think about. Here he is thinking about deterritorialization as something positive, at least, and maybe he's even though I think this discussion, it looks like, is within the confines of an ethnological analysis. And so we have to think about this critically, because he could be saying, from the standpoint of ethnologists who are wanting to distinguish between the quote unquote primitive society, which we've talked about ad infinitum with Baudrillard, Lyotard, but the primitives are weak because they're tied to the soil in a way that's different from, let's say, the Volk of the German Aryans, who are, going out and deterritorializing the neighbors and whatnot in order to make their living space. That's where I think deterritorialization and the war machine, again, we don't have to think of them conceptually like Deleuze and Guattari, maybe a little bit more literally, stand out here, where there's something quote unquote powerful about the colonizers because they come in and they deterritorialize, like literally, right? We can already think about what's happening in Gaza and whatnot. So I do think we need to be a little bit critical about. We don't necessarily have to. This third person narration he's doing, I don't think we necessarily need to agree with this is a declarative statement, but he is, I think, framing the question of one of the aspects of the vector of war, and yeah.
This is an interesting aside because one of the first times that I became aware of von Clausewitz is the movie Crimson Tide.
Yes. Okay.
Starring Gene Hackman.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like the officers, I think, are gathered for dinner, and Denzel Washington is the XO, and Gene Hackman's character is talking about von Clausewitz said the war is the continuation of politics by other means.
Yes.
But so what's interesting here too is like the submarine itself goes to this concept of fleet of being in a more like it's just another evolution of that concept, because you could be able to strike unaware, before the defense can respond, etc. But what is also quite coincidentally interesting is the way that what happens in like the plot of Crimson Tide is they become disconnected from command, like their radio rope,
Yes.
or like they lose communication, and the last order that they receive is to launch their nuclear weapons against Russia.
Yes.
And then once that communication is cut off, it becomes this internal struggle between Gene Hackman and Denzel Washington, the XO and the commander of the ship and so forth. But underscoring that is the relationship or the concept of the war machine, right? As being this something that is that operates outside of the state apparatus to a certain degree. So you can kind of see, I don't know, maybe that's too on the nose, but just a really
that's
quite
something
interesting.
we'll have to come back to, right? Because there is an intense, I'll use the word dialectic, between the war machine and the state that we'll have to analyze when we get to the 12th plateau. But you're right, at least originally, as Deleuze and Guattari argue, the war machine is exterior, external, but there is an interplay in which somehow, by wile and guile, the state appropriates a war machine. And so it is interesting to think about your way of reading that, right, as that cutting off communication reinforces the type of internal externality. It's an ambiguity, right?
Yeah, and I mean this literally to go to the accident too. It's like there are recorded instances in history where it's like these Soviet personnel were like they, it came close to like I think there was multiple, at least one occasion where they were like they got this false signal that they were getting ready to launch nukes in retaliation against the U.S. But
Right.
this like one individual kind of was like, like I don't know this. I'd have to look up the specifics. I don't remember that, but I definitely know this happened on at least one occasion where like basically this one guy basically prevented the whole world from being annihilated to nuclear war. Maybe that's being a little bit dramatic, but
No, that's interesting. I did look up because I do remember he quotes. It's one of the, if not the most famous quote of Clausewitz, right? I think it's just called "On War" or "Of War," and he says, "This is page 43. The time has come, it seems, to face the facts. Revolution is movement, but movement is not a revolution. Politics is only a gear shift, and revolution only its overdrive. War as, quote, continuation of politics by other means, unquote, would be instead a police pursuit at greater speed with other vehicles." It goes on, but, you know, uh, he goes on and back to his historical analysis, but I do think uh, I wonder sometimes really I do feel like you think he's going to go one way, but he goes another, and he is continuously taking these detours and trajectories. So even his speed of writing is interesting because it's these calculated uh, skirmishes and advances, and then strategic retreats to launch a new sort of volley onto a different target. And I think that's why I would like to read it again, because I do feel like there's almost a way of differentiating the different curves and maybe finding the transversal, the diagonal that he's plotting. And um, I think on a first read, it's hard to see the that continuation. But I'm not meaning that as a critique. It's just something that I'm reflecting on his way of writing and his way of throwing out something very interesting and polemical there, and then pulling back immediately to to artillery under Louis XIV. Right? It's kind of like, again, he makes this. It's time to face the facts, and makes this claim about revolution, and then, of course, sure, the French Revolution is going to be one of those vectors and what leads up to it, but it that mixing of the theoretical with the historical and back again, it's a bit, like I say, it gives you vertigo, but it does require one to be patient with the writing. Let's see, what else do you want to, let's see, what else we want to jump to. um Man, I do love that you have no methodology here. I do think that when we get deeper into A Thousand Plateaus, we definitely want to keep in mind, I do think, this notion of speed and what it entails, because even before getting to that, Deleuze in 67, 68, 72, he's thinking about um, this question of a nomadic distribution versus a sedentary distribution. And so I think it has immediate ties to like Virilio's dromological analyses.
Yeah. I mean, does that not go directly back to that distinction between the fortress, the castle versus the sort of more the offensive means of war as the primary focus?
The fortress, the castle, and then as he analyzes here and there the evolution of the tank, because the tank is a kind of mobile fortress.
Okay.
And I believe the tank itself has a slope, or most tanks, some tanks do at least, has a protected front that's called a glossy.
Oh, interesting.
I believe, and I assume that that's not a coincidence with um, the fortifications castles we're talking about.
Yeah.
And
I mean, I know you often too see the way that the tracks of the tank, typically they have that front area that has it's angled up a bit so that
mhm.
it can, when it does encounter a slope of some kind, it's better situated to negotiate that than if it remained like a flat. Although I don't know if that necessarily comes into play with every single form of tank, but I feel like I've seen that sort of feature, that design feature in play.
Yes, it is called a glossy. That's right. Yeah. Anyway,
Fascinating.
uh, let's see what other reduction of distances. I guess that almost feels, um, on the one hand, that feels intuitive and almost obvious, but I think it's worth saying that um, one of his arguments, and I'm not sure, his argument was basically, it seemed to be like with something like gunpowder, which seems like the most obvious example. I'm sure there are others, but with this hyper acceleration compared to other projectiles with gunfire, there is this reduction of speed. And I don't know if, what's interesting, I would love to see this. I didn't see it in the dictionary, but I do feel like one of the terms that is almost a concept, at very least, it's close to it, is that capital A assault that he brings up early in the book when he uses it in various senses. But the first time he brings it up is this notion of almost like cannon fodder, where he's theorizing this notion of like rushing to one's death to take out whether it be the cannoneers or to take out, we can imagine, you could think about the crossbowmen behind the embouchures that you brought up earlier, like this notion of a headlong flight towards one's death in assault. um I thought that was a kind of interesting. I would have to look at the text, but I do feel like this is the reduction of distances he's talking about with with bullet technology. Um, Strategic retreat seems less of a possibility than this headlong flight, and that already presages kind of the way that Deleuze and Guattari will take up again from Virilio this notion of the suicidal state to define fascism. Um, Again, we'll see that in A Thousand Plateaus. Let me see if I can find. Yeah, let's see. Okay. So all greatness is an assault, an inaccurate translation of Plato. So that's at the end of the book, but I'm wondering where. I'm not finding it.
Something interesting I was thinking about was that, like, as far as the projectile is concerned, and kind of this movement from like the basic concept of like throwing a rock at a certain like level of like prehistoric
Yeah,
warfare or violence, or even like a sword fight, for example, is kind of a projectile in a certain fashion. And like even looking, you know what I mean, like in terms of one-on-one combat with a sword, you're sort of looking for the weak points, the chinks in the armor, so to speak. So like the joints and so forth, those are the vulnerable spots with respect to defense. but to draw that even like further in a different context, whenever we discuss space travel, for example, this notion of defense becomes far more. It actually reasserts itself in a very direct way, because at the speeds that projectiles travel through space, like a very small piece of matter can really, you know what I mean? It's a tremendous threat and so forth. And so another problem that has to be solved whenever we should we ever really ramp up actual like manned space flight on a wider scale, you know. I think you can even look up pictures. I think there's crazy pictures of like the cladding or whatever on spaceships or the shuttle or whatever getting dented by like very tiny bits of matter particles.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That's the. I think that was. I swear it was maybe Simondon who says offhand this retraining that astronauts need to do, because while the weight difference is negated or virtually negated or at least cut it drastically, and so movement seems more free, um, there's still this relation of impact with acceleration, right? And so there is almost an illusion that one is not accelerating as quickly because of this, because on Earth we've standardized this notion of mass and weight in a kind of equilibrium, and once that equilibrium is out of order in space due to the lack of gravitational forces, there's an there's a way that one's body and mind needs to be retrained to reorient oneself so that you're not colliding with much greater force than one thing, than you might think. That was part of the reason why I brought up this interesting interplay between speed and acceleration, and how, and obviously in science they have real differences and real effects, and sometimes they can get conflated for the purposes of non-scientific statements like Napoleon's, right? That the force of an army is its mass times its speed, which I said is not that's not the that's not the physics formula, right? But that's the slippage between an understanding of speed and acceleration as the same. Um, all right. Any other? Obviously,
I don't think I have much else to discuss, quite
I mean,
honestly.
we did cover a lot. I think that one thing I would say to the listener, because there is a lot going on in the book. This is one of those books that can't necessarily just be broken down argument by argument. It is a kind of continuous, ongoing reflection on these historical developments, and that too is part of his intrigue, and maybe part of why reading quickly is, at least for a first time, better than reading slowly. Trying to take every little bit in can easily lose the forest for the trees, or vice versa. There's something he does too in Warren Cinema that reminds me of this type of movement, this movement from a theoretical to a historical, that blends together in ways that can be difficult to try to suss out the particular stakes. But again, I don't necessarily want to critique him for that. That's just an interesting stylistic particularity, and um, we could, for the most part, keep this a shorter episode if you'd like.
Yeah, I think I'm okay with that.
Okay.
I might just wrap up and say that War and Cinema certainly would be a good companion read, because I think, especially the way that he talks about things like the reconnaissance flights and like the development of the airplane and how that changes. You know, you can look at warfare in World War One, trench warfare, where like there's not a lot of speed and of movement as far as the, you know what I mean? You have kind of the no man's land. There's not like, you're going to have these entrenched armies, like literally in trenches. Whereas, you know, the ability of an airplane to fly over and drop projectiles on those spaces becomes, you know, it kind of negates that whole mode of war itself.
Yes.
Just as one example.
No, I absolutely agree. And I think that one of the things, and I've already said it in the episode, I'll just reiterate, one of the things is we will sort of revisit and deepen our reflections on Virilio in the future, in the later episodes on Virilio in our discussion of 1,000 Plateaus.
But if you're ready to call it,
yeah,
consider that a wrap for this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour. We'll see you all next week.
The very rules of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is unconscious, to the whole state of things, pure violence without object anymore. This is a typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here. What I meant is the following.
With nothing left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people, as in Clockwork Orange.